Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, this meeting with the delegation from Tibet is now in session. The head of the delegation is Mr. Bai Ma Wang Dui, and we welcome him to the Committee of Foreign Affairs and International Development. Ms. Chen is going to be the translator, I understand. And so what we would ask the head of the delegation is to introduce his colleagues that are at the table, and then we'll go right into a presentation for roughly 10 minutes and then into questions and answers as we usually do. So I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Bam Wang Dui.
首先是对代表团来访，全国人大西藏代表团来访表示欢迎。那么，想请这团长来介绍一下代表团的主要成员。之后呢，请团长做一个主要的发言。
好，尊敬的嘉义会众议员外委会主席诺特先生，以及委员会的各位朋友。我们呢很高兴啊，全国人大西藏代表团来到加拿大进行访问，特别是今天来到我们外委会啊，同外委会的各位朋友们进行交流。那么首先我介绍一下全国人大西藏代表团出席这次访问的同志有，全国人大代表西藏山南市委副书记市长普布顿珠同志。
Distinguished Chairman Knott and friends from Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee. It is really pleased for me and my delegation to visit Canada, especially the Foreign Affairs Committee here today, and to have discussions with our counterparts. If I may, I would like to introduce the major members from our delegation. Mr. Pu Budun Zhu, Deputy to the National People's Congress, and he's also the mayor of Shannan City from Tibet Autonomous Region.
自治区人大代表，西藏自治区人大民族宗教外侨委员会副主任多吉次仁先生。
Mr. 多吉次仁, he is the deputy to the People's Congress of Tibet Autonomous Region and vice chair of the Committee on Ethnic, Religious, Foreign, and Overseas Chinese Affairs of the People's Congress of Tibet Autonomous Region.
西藏自治区人大代表，西藏自治区山南市扎兰县政协副主席、扎兰县民主临时管委会副主任阿旺丹增。
Mr. Awang Danzeng, he is the deputy to the People's Congress of Tibet Autonomous Region and vice chair of Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference of Zhanan County of Shannan City. And also the Deputy Director General of the Administrative Office of Minzhuling Temple, also located in the Zhanan County and in Tibet Autonomous Region.
我本人是西藏自治区人大代表，区党委常委、拉萨市委书记。
I myself is the deputy to the People's Congress of Tibet Autonomous Region and the secretary of Lhasa Municipal Committee of Communist Party of China.
目前呢，这个中加关系发展良好，两国的这个高层交往也很密切，特别是各个层级的经贸、商谈这种交流十分的频繁。那么今年又是中加的旅游合作年，在这样的一个时机我们来到了这个美丽的加拿大。也感到非常的高兴。
At present, the China-Canada relationship has maintained a good momentum of development with close contact between the two higher levels. And we have also witnessed frequent economic and trade exchanges between the two sides. And this year is the China-Canada tourism year, and we come here this year at this time, and which makes me feel quite happy.
下面呢，我想西藏的有些简单的情况，向大家做个介绍。
I would like to brief you about the basic situation of Tibet.
西藏呢是位于中国的这个西南，也是中国5个少数民族省份之一。西藏的国土面积有120多万平方公里，目前呢人口是337万人。
The Tibet Autonomous Region locates in the southwest part of China. It is one of the 5 autonomous regions in China. It covers an area of 1.2 million square kilometers with the population of 3.37 million.
那么西藏呢，自古以来就是中国的这个不可分割的一部分。
Tibet is a integral part of China since ancient time.
那么自远古以来这个人类在高原生存的过程当中和祖国内地这个政治、经济、文化有着这个密切的交往。自元朝以来这个西藏当时的地方这个正式划入了我们祖国的版图。那么后来的清朝、明朝国民政府时期对西藏的地方政府实施了有效的管理。
Starting from the ancient time, and the Tibetan people live in the Qinghai and Tibet plateau. But we have a close and even closer relationship and exchanges with the inner land in terms of the politics, economies, and cultures. And in the following dynasties in Yuan, Qing, and Ming, and also Yuan, Ming, and Qing, and also the Republic of China, the central government has exercised effective administration over Tibet, and with especially the fact that in the dynasty of Yuan, Tibet was incorporated into the map of China.
那么1951年和平解放西藏废除了这个封建农奴制以后西藏各族人民的生活得到了这个极大的改善。
In the year 1951, we have the peaceful liberation happened in Tibet, which eliminated the feudal serfdom in this land and have improved the people's livelihood a lot.
居住在高原的这个广大的农牧民他们获得了农田、草场、生畜从农奴主剥削下的获得了这个人身的自由，得到了解放。
The farmers and herdsmen living on the plateau, they are given their land, grassland, and the livestock for survival and living, and saying goodbye to the lives which was being exploited by the slave owners, and they have become the master of their lives.
那么和平解放以来在中央政府的正确领导，这个大力支持，特别是内地各省份的有力援助下，西藏的这个经济社会这个群众的这个民生各方面得到了这个极大的改善。
Starting from the peaceful liberation, with the leadership and the support from the central government of China, and also the effective assistance from the other provinces in China, the situation in Tibet has been improved a lot.
特别是党的18大以来在以习近平同志为核心的中央领导下，认真落实以人民为中心的发展的理念，西藏人民的这个生活水平得到了快速的提升。
Especially starting from the 18th Party Congress, and also under the leadership of the Communist Party of China with Mr. Xi Jinping as its core, we have carried out the concept, the people-centered concept, and improved the economic and social and various situations in Tibet.
一个呢是经济得到了快速的发展，这个基础设施得到了这个有效的改善。
For one thing, the economy grows rapidly there, and the infrastructure also improved.
那么西藏自治区的2017年地区生产总值达到了1310亿元，比这个解放前的民主改革前的1.3个亿翻了1000倍。
In terms of the GDP, the number in the year 2017 accounted for 131 billion RMB, which is 1,000 times more than that in the very beginning of peaceful liberation, and only about 130 million RMB.
西藏的这个基础设施得到了这个很大的改善，综合交通体系基本形成。目前呢。 铁路格尔木到拉萨，拉萨到日喀则，那么公路通车的里程达到这个9万公里。那么另外呢，我们的这个现代化的机场建成了这个5座，我们内地通航的城市达到47个，通航的这个航线有79条航线。
The infrastructure in Tibet is much better than previous times, and we have established a comprehensive transportation system, including the railway, the highway, and the aviation. For example, we have already put into force the railway from Geermu to Lhasa and from Lhasa to Rikadze, and the mileage of the highway accounted for 90,000 kilometers. And we have 5 airports in the region, which can help us reach to 47 cities in this country, and we with 79 flights, 79 airlines.
那么综合能源体系呢也基本形成，特别是清洁的综合能源体系。目前呢，我们的这个电力装机达到309万。 千瓦，那么主要是以水电、风能、太阳能为主的这个清洁能源，覆盖呢我们62个县区。
One thing to mention is that the energy system has developed quite rapidly, especially the clean energy, and the installed capacity of the electricity has reached about 3.9 million kilowatts, and we have a clean energy mix composed of water power, the wind power, and solar power, which can reach to 62 counties in this region.
主要是人民的生活水平得到了显著的提升。那么2017年我们农牧民群众的人均收入超过了1万，达到了10330元。
Especially, we can see the progress of Tibet in the per capita GDP. The number for the year 2017 is over 10,000 RMB.
居住的条件得到了这个有效的改善。我们实施安居工程农村危房改造，还有扶贫搬迁这个有40多万农民的房子得到了改善。现在总共40多万户240多万人的这个居住条件它的这个舒适度、安全性得到了有效的提升。那么教育，我们广大的群众的这个学前教育、基础教育高等教育，这个包括继续教育得到了全面的发展，并实施的是3包政策：包吃、包住、包学费。那么目前呢，西藏有66万个学生在校学生，那么每年大学毕业出来的有1.8万人，进入这个社会。
The living conditions in Tibet is also much better than before, and we have a lot of projects and programs launched to make sure that people have comfortable and safe living conditions. It has benefited about 400,000 households and 2.4 million people in Tibet. In terms of the education, we have paid much attention to the improvement of the whole education system, including the preschool education, the basic education, the high-level education, and also the continuing education. And for the compulsory education, we have the students, they don't need to pay for their accommodation, their food, and also their tuitions in the school. And there are about 660,000 students in universities and in colleges, and with 18,000 graduates every year.
那么公共医疗服务体系啊，也基本形成。我们地市的有中心医院，各县，这个县医院，这个乡卫生院、村卫生室。那么4级的这个公共医疗服务体系啊，基本建成，这个农牧民的这个健康水平啊，有了显著的提升。广大农牧民实施的是免费医疗制度。那么农牧区的这个公共健康水平有显著的提升。那么人均这个预期寿命啊，从解放初期的35.5岁啊，目前提升到这个68.1岁。
The medical service system in Tibet is also much more improved, and we have the medical service which is free of charge for 4 levels, namely the city level, the prefecture level, the county level, and the township level in the whole region. And we fundamentally improved the medical service of the farmers and herdsmen living there, and the life expectancy has been remarkably increased from 35.5 in the beginning of liberation and to 68.1 currently.
当然，这些纵向比啊，我们这个发展进步很快，但是横向比啊，特别是像我们加拿大这样的一个发达国家比啊，我们还是低水平的，我们还需要不断的努力，不断的提升。
Compared with what we are before, we have achieved a lot, but compared with the other countries, other regions, and including Canada, I think we are still comparatively low-level development, which requires further and more effort in the future.
同时呢，我们西藏的这个各族人民的这个文化权利啊、人权啊，都得到了有效的保障。我们西藏的这个藏语言文字啊，这个有法定受到法律的保护，专门出台了这个关于这个学习、使用、发展藏语言文字的这个政策，对藏语文的语言的使用啊，都已有了明确的规定。在我们的这个公务活动、社会活动啊各个方面啊，都广泛的使用我们本民族的语言，而且呢，这个现代的这个教育的教材体系啊，藏语文的教材体系已经编制形成，有效的这个保护、促进和发展了藏族的这个文化。另外呢，我们这个宗教信仰自由啊，得到了这个广泛的这个尊重和保护。那么西藏当前呢有宗教活动场所1700多处，僧尼呢有4.6万人，完全能够满足广大信教群众对宗教活动的需求。那么最近随着这个人民生活水平的提升交通条件的改善我是作为拉萨市在拉萨来这个从事朝拜的参与宗教活动的人越来越多，而且这个规模越来越大，我们需要用大量的这个 服务来维持正常的这个宗教活动的秩序。目前拉萨有磕长头的，有转经的，有寺庙里面烧香拜佛的。应该说我们加拿大到拉萨去的人比较多，肯定大家都有所知道。
The various ethnic groups living in Tibet has enjoyed good protection of human rights and cultural rights, and especially in the protection of spoken and written languages in Tibet. And the government has issued policies and regulations in better learning, using and developing the local spoken and written languages. And there are clear-cut stipulations in the policies, which can quite a lot helps us, for the local people, to use their own languages in the work or in aspect of livings. And also, we have finished the process of compiling the Tibetan language teaching text, which is used in the schools currently, and also in aspect of the protection of local culture. Talking about the religious belief freedom, I think it is quite ideologically respected and protected in Tibet. We currently have 1,700 sites for religious belief and 46,000 monks and nuns living in the monasteries and the temples, which can satisfy the needs of the worshippers. And as the living standards improved and the transportation conditions become better, and more people outside of the Tibet are involved in the worshipping activities of, the religious activities, and which has means the government, the Lhasa and the Tibetan government needs to do more to provide a related service. And they worship in various ways, like kneeling down in the koto and having the prayer wheel in their hand, or go inside the monasteries to worship. And I think there are a lot of Canadian people have already come to Canada, to Tibet, and I think you have know a lot about that.
当前呢，这个西藏高原啊，生态环境应该说仍然是这个保持持续良好，也是这个全球啊，生态环境最好，保持这个原生态成分最多的地区之一。
The ecological environment is good. It's well protected in Tibet. I think it has a very good condition for the ecological protection among from the global perspective.
第一个呢是大家的这个对生态环境保护的思想认识高度统一。这个习近平总书记提出啊，绿水青山就是金山银山。那么我们西藏呢，也冰天雪地也是金山银山的这样的一个理念。这个对环境的保护啊，大家认识啊，有高度的一致。第二个呢，我们实施了这个青藏高原生态安全与屏障与保护建设规划，国务院专门批了这么一个规划，对青藏高原的生态环境的保护和建设做出这个科学的规划。这里面的核心呢，就是一个呢实行这个生力生态啊效益补偿，林业上的生力生态每年国家拿7.7个亿。第二个呢，对西藏最大的生态系统草原啊，国家每年拿20个亿啊进行生态的这个奖励的这个补偿机制。那么第三个呢，就西藏呢实行这个自然保护区面积最大的41万平方公里啊，将近整个西藏国土面积的1/3啊，进行建立这个国家自然保护区的这样的一个制度。应该说这些制度的有效的实施啊，青藏高原的这个目前环境质量是比较好的。那么我们拉萨市啊，全国的这个每年的 环境质量通报的时候，都是前3位的。今年第1季度我们是仅次于海南，我们是第二位的。
In terms of the ecological protection, I think there are many reasons attributed to the improvement. And first of all, it is the improved awareness of all walks of life living there, and we carried out the concept. Proposed by President Xi that the Green Mountains are the mountains of treasure, and even the plateau of Tibet is snow-capped, but we still think it can also turn into the mountain of treasure if we protect the environment well. And the second is that the State Council or the central government has the plan for the ecological environment on Qinghai and the Tibet Plateau. And to be specific, and there are about 770 million RMB compensation for the environmental protection, and from which 2 billion RMB are for that protection of grassland in Tibet. And the third point, which is not the last but not the least point, is we have allocated about 1/3 of the total territory of Tibet to be the natural reserve. And it covers about 410,000 square kilometers, and which provide the good condition for environmental protection. And I worked in Lhasa, which is the capital city of Tibet Autonomous Region, and we have the quite good environmental quality, and maybe top 3 among all the cities in China. And for the first quarter of this year, we ranked the 2nd among all of the cities in this country.
那么我主要呢介绍这么一些。这次这2天啊，在加拿大的访问，我们也看到了贵国的好多很好的先进的理念啊，很好的做法，我们将会带回去啊，进一步提升我们的工作水平，更好的服务于西藏人民。
And I think I will just stop my introduction now here. And during my 2 days and quite short stay here in Canada, I've learned a lot of good things, a good experience from Canada. I think I will take that back to my country and to my region, which can further improve the local area a lot in the future.
Thank you very much to Mr. Baimang Wangdui for his presentation. Colleagues, we're going to get right into questions, and we're going to start with Mr. Janis, please. Garnet?
Ne tonang chong song rong bouquet tsap la gua ke gyap ki dua. Now, members may not know, but that was, though badly, the first time the Tibetan language has been used thus far in this meeting. I think perhaps it's revealing enough, sir, that you came here and spoke as a representative purportedly of the Tibetan people, but you didn't use the Tibetan language, you spoke Chinese. And of course, I think members may know that there's a gentleman, Tashi Wangchuk, who is an advocate for the Tibetan language, who currently faces 15 years in prison as a result of his advocacy and his simple statements on his blog that China's own laws should be followed with respect to the ability to use the Tibetan language. I'm also struck by how you talk allegedly about all these economic improvements, and yet Canadian officials tell us that they don't even get the basic access to Tibet to check on the status of Canadian development projects. So how are we to in any way assess the credibility of the claims you're making when even projects that Canadian tax dollars are funding, our officials can't get in to see their progress, and they're told by Chinese officials after those projects are complete, well, it's no longer a concern of Canada, even though it's a Canadian-funded project. So all these claims about human rights, about economic development, it's striking in light of the complete denial of access, and in light of the fact that Freedom House says that Tibet is the second least free place in the world after Syria. We have no ability to assess your claims because your government doesn't allow us access. And that's unfortunate because I think we would like to assess the veracity of the claims you've made. I want to ask you a specific question, and this deals with the whereabouts of the Panchen Lama. Gendun Choki Nyama is recognized by the Dalai Lama and by the international Tibetan community as the 11th Panchen Lama. Oh, I'm sorry, the translation,
The
yeah.
translator
Okay.
will have to translate. If you go too far,
Okay.
it will be very difficult for Ms. Chen to translate. So maybe we'll let Ms. Chen translate
Sure.
what you've said so far.
First now and then you can move on.
Thank you.
感谢您刚才非常详尽的介绍。那么我现在请我的同事来进行发言。我刚才就是他现在是他的话，他一开始说的这段呢是藏语，这可能大家也不一定认同啊，但我个人认为呢，这是在这个地方第一次使用藏文的语言，在这个会议室，这也充分代表了我们现在呢是跟就是来自西藏的朋友来进行交流。但是呢，从你们的对话、你们的这个发言中间，我发现你们说的是中文而不是藏文。虽然说你们代表的应该是来自西藏地区的，那么另外有一个是叫他是温巧这一个人呢，他呢是目前呢被判了15年的这个牢狱，他呢也是支持使用藏语言的。但是就是因为在他的博客中间有一些言论，而对于这个藏语言文字的支持的一个言论，而被政府呢这个封锁，于是呢通过法律的手段，然后呢目前呢是让他没有获得人身自由。您刚才很多时候呢都会说到这个西藏经济社会的发展，但是呢，对于加拿大的官员或者说民众来说，尤其是官员吧，我们都没有机会，都不允许进入西藏来感受到您刚才所说的经济和社会的发展情况。如果不让我们进去看，我们又如何能够了解，来证实您那个政府所说这些情况的真实可信性呢？虽然说有一些加拿大方面所这个提供资金的一些项目，但是我们仍然没有从这个落实中间看到成果。刚才呢。就是我通过一个信息了解到，认为是西藏呢是除了以色列之外，是世界上最不自由的一个地区。政府呢不允许加拿大的官员来到西藏，正因为如此，所以呢我们也没有机会来了解。
My comments then. I was asking about the Panchen Lama, recognized by the Dalai Lama and by the international Tibetan community. He just celebrated, we hope, his 29th birthday, but we don't know if he's dead or alive because he, along with his parents, were abducted by PRC authorities when he was 6 years old. So I would like to ask you, sir, if you know, is the Panchen Lama, Mr. Gendun Choki Nyama, is he dead or alive? Are his parents dead or alive? Where are they? And can international independent authorities have any opportunity to access them? Thank you.
我想问一个非常具体的问题，是关于丹顿雀吉尼玛的。那么，在他6岁的时候呢，他是被这个政府带走。那么，我想他应该是在不久前刚过29岁生日。那我们对他个人的这个生死状况以及他的家人的这个目前的状况表示担忧。那么，想问一下，是他本人目前的情况是死是活？他的父母、他的家人的一些情况，以及如何能够证实这一些？
好，是吧？刚才你提到的个案的问题啊，中国是个法治国家，既然法律进行了制裁，那肯定有他这个犯罪的证据和事实啊，这是我们国家国内是公开透明的。至于具体你说的那个人的情况，我不是很清楚。但是我相信这是一个法治国家，它有法律实施的。第二个呢，你刚才说，这个我们今天使用的是国语，国家的通用语言，没有用藏语，这个藏语也可以用。今天有人能对的话，我可以给他对用。但是呢，咱们提出来这个时间非常有限，我这翻成藏语再翻成汉语，再英语再翻译到，我们就耽误时间了。为了节省时间了。那么关于到西藏去的问题，我们是非常欢迎，西藏是开放的，也是一直都是实行的是对外开放的政策， 也有不少的国内外的游客，都到西藏去。当然，西藏是一个特殊的地区，是一个高原地区，那里的去了人们和内地去还是不一样的。当然，西藏去，我们是欢迎，对我们，对全球友好的同志们去。对于从事国家分裂破坏活动的，我们西藏人民是不欢迎的。那么关于你说的甘丹曲奇尼玛是吧？甘丹曲奇尼玛是一个西藏的一个，你们说的，在我们看来，他是一个正常的公民。那么他过着普通人一样的生活，享受着这个现代的教育，现在应该说已经大学毕业了啊，过得非常好的生活。由于他这个介入了这么一件事，他不愿意他们和他的家人被外界打扰。适当的时候，你会看到他过得好好的。
Talking about the case you referred to, and I didn't understand a lot or quite well about the details. But I think, I believe China is a country under the rule of law, and we have ample evidence for any criminals which was punished according to the law and the regulations of China. And the second is about the language. And talking about we're using the Chinese rather than the Tibetan language. Since Chinese is a universal language in China, used in China, I think it is no problem with us for speaking Chinese. But if any one of you can speak Tibetan languages, then it is okay for me. Just let's talk in Tibetan language. But just to save time, from Tibetan to Chinese and then Chinese to English, we'll have a double translation. And only in light of time, we are going to speak in Chinese. And third point is about the opening up of Tibet. I think as the country is become more is open and more open to the outside world, and Tibet is also more open, and there are more and more tourists from inside or outside China coming to Tibet. But one thing I need to mention is that it's a very special area. It locates in the plateau, and the geological situation is not quite the same with that in the inland of China. But we welcome all of those people who support who are friendly toward us. But with the Tibetan people will never welcome those who uphold or support the separatist activities or impeding the unity of China. And talking about the Gandan Chadnima, he is the ordinary citizen of China and having an ordinary life in Tibet. He has already received the modern education, and I think he and his family members don't want to, and are not willing to be interrupted by the external environment. And I think if there is an opportunity, you will see that he has a very good life now.
We'll now go to Mr. Varani, please.
Gentleman here who's offered to translate if the witness would like to speak in the Tibetan language. There's someone who can translate if there's of interest in that.
I think I'll accept the argument of the translator with the limited time that we have. I don't think that'll work for us, Garnet, so I think we'll go to Mr. Varani, and we'll stick with the translation that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I appreciate you being here. We appreciate the stronger ties that we're developing with China and the government of the People's Republic. This allows us to discuss a wide range of issues, including matters of human rights that our government always raises when interacting with foreign partners and foreign allies. I take particular interest in human rights matters as a constitutional and human rights lawyer, as a member who represents a riding that includes 7,000 Tibetan Canadians, so Tashi Delek, and also as the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet. So if you could just translate that first, please.
Could you just repeat the latter part?
As the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet.
Mm-hmm. 他是那个西藏支流小组。Yes, I think maybe the question.
So, okay, I'll
Maybe
keep going.
repeat that, Mr. Barani.
I said I take particular interest in human rights matters as a
Yes.
human rights and constitutional lawyer, as a member who represents a riding that has 7,000 Tibetan Canadians, and as the chair of the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet group.
感谢呢，大家这个来到这里，我们有抽时间跟大家一起来见面。那么加拿大跟中国这个政府之间的关系，官方的往来呢也是非常好的，这是我们也乐见的。这次代表团访华呢，也给我们一个机会，能够双方就很多层面的一些问题呢进行讨论，也包括人权，因为人权是政府以及这个尤其是外交方面一个非常重要的一部分。那么我想说的是，关于人权呢，也是这个是加方非常重视的，尤其是目前呢在7000的在加拿大的这个藏人的权利。
So with that preamble, I want to ask you 3 categories of questions, all of which arise from a public response from the Minister of Foreign Affairs to a petition that was tabled by Mr. Garrison in the House of Commons. The first relates to Tashi Wangchuk, the case that was outlined by Mr. Jenis. I wanted to ask you specifically, he was charged with inciting separatism under your Chinese criminal code for advocating for the cultural rights of Tibetans to study in the Tibetan language. Promoting cultural language and language identity is a significant priority for our government. We're doing this with Indigenous languages here in Canada. So I wanted to ask you why the government of Canada was denied permission to attend Tashi Wangchuk's trial, which took place on January 4th. What was the decision of the court? And why is advocating for language rights viewed as a separatist activity? So that's the first set of questions. The second set of questions relates to the Panchen Lama, again raised by Mr. Jenis. And I wanted to ask you, you have confirmed that he is alive, that his parents are alive, based on your previous response. So I wanted to know if you would be willing to arrange for a Canadian or an international delegation to visit Gendun Choki Nyama in the coming months. And the third point relates to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Sino-Tibetan dialogue. That is a dialogue that took place with 9 meetings between the People's Republic and envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. There were 9 meetings between 2002 and 2010. We wanted to ask why, in your opinion, has that Sino-Tibetan dialogue about the middle way approach been stalled since 2010? And what conditions would be necessary for China to return to the dialogue table? Because I think that returning to that dialogue to discuss the middle way approach is an important issue for Tibetan Canadians in this country. Thank you. Tuji-che.
我想说呢，是一个关于我的刚才那位同事也说到的，一个个案。刚才是说，因为支持使用和保护藏文化和藏语言呢，而被这个判刑。根据中国的当时呢，根据中国的法律和他被判刑的一个罪名呢是这个煽动这个国家分裂的这样的一个罪名。那么我就想问，他是支持和这个保护藏语言的文化，他为什么会因此而获得这样的一个罪名？难道这两个是互相矛盾的吗？第二点呢是关于刚才也是我的同事所说的，班禅喇嘛就是根顿却吉尼玛，您是否可以确认他目前仍然是还活着？那么他的家人是否也还是活着？是否生活得好？关于这个。是否有这样的一个可能性，在未来的几个月，可不可以允许加拿大的代表团或者国际人士的代表团来访问西藏，让我们来这个能够接触到这个根顿却吉尼玛，来确认中方的一些说法。第三个问题是关于达赖喇嘛的。那么是据我们所了解呢，从2002年到2010年之间呢，这个中国的中央政府以及和西藏这个流亡达赖方面呢， 开展了这个9次的接触商谈。讨论的一个重点呢是关于中间道路的。那么到目前为止呢，商谈是还没有继续下去而停止了。何时能够重新启动这样的一个商谈？为了重返这样一个商谈的轨道，重返我们对中间道路这个非常重要的一个这个达赖的主张的一个轨道，我们会有什么样的条件？达到什么样的条件才能够回到这样的轨道上来？
好，刚才提到的这个人权的个案的问题啊，他肯定是打着这个保护藏语文的这样的一个权利的名义啊，从事分裂破坏活动，没有罪证的话，我们不会进行给他定罪的。他有实施的造成的现实的危害，予以定罪的。不是说他就说为了保护西藏的语言文字啊而进行定罪，没有这一说。可能这是一个层面。第二个呢，跟他去你们的事，刚才说的我已经说得很清楚他健康快乐的成长，接受了现代的教育，我们要尊重他本人和他家人的意愿。我们今天讨论的是人权，如果他本人不愿意接受，他的家人不愿意外界的打扰，我们也得要尊重他本人和他家人的意见，不能说我们在座的一部分人提出来，我非要去看你的家，让你把它放在社会上，这个呢，我觉得需要双边都要考虑的问题。那么第三个呢，就是关于中间道路的问题。中间道路为什么谈不下去？中间道路它的本质，还是要西藏要独立的立场没变。咱们只要认真的研究的话，中间道路他提出来的有些这个旗帜啊，他的帽子口号看起来是要谈判，他的实质内容啊他就是个变相独立。这个我相信你们都可能只要上过高等教育的，或者是稍稍懂一点的人啊，都会研究，好好的研究一下这个内容啊，你就会发现这个中间道路就是一个变相的独立，甚至呢还更不存在的原来什么所谓的这个大藏区啊，也放在里边，所以也理所当然，中国政府是不能接受的，西藏人民也不会接受的。更主要的呢，就是所谓的达赖集团，他们提出的高度自治也好，中间道路也好，他们要维护他们已经失去的封建农奴制的这个特权，这是西藏人民是不会答应的。所以呢，我有一个建议啊，我们在座的，考虑西藏问题的时候，就站在什么样的角度去考虑？你首先要考虑，西藏大多数的农民群众，他想要什么？我们其他国家的有很多同志啊，都到拉萨去西藏和我深入的讨论过这个问题。多数群众他的要求是什么？他的需求是什么？他的愿望是什么？如果离开了这个问题啊，这个研究西藏的问题，代表少数人的或者是极端的思想去考虑研究啊，在西藏问题上不会得出好的结论，也不会起到什么作用。最近几年，西藏社会其实非常稳定，一起自焚的都没有。所谓的自焚啊，可能 邻省其他战区可能也有个别的，因此呢，我们建议啊，大多数的西藏的底层的群体的，他思想里面想什么，他需要什么，我们多考虑的话，对西藏的问题肯定会有一个正确的看法，我就。
Talking about the case of human rights, and I think there's no conflict or between the protection of the Tibetan local spoken and written language and the protection of and the rule of law. I think that is the person you mentioned. What he said is to protect the local languages, no matter in spoken or written. But what he did is to incite the separatist activities, and we need to focus on what he really did, but rather than what he said. And the second, you mentioned the Ganden Chojanima, and I would like to repeat again that he has a really healthy and happy life in Tibet, and he has received a good and modern education. And we need to respect the willingness of him and also his family members. We're talking about the human rights, then we need to respect everybody's rights, including Ganden Chojanima. If he don't want to be interrupted by the outside world, then we need to respect him. And it is irrational, I think, for the you mentioned the Canadian delegation or the international delegation to come to Tibet, which may interrupt his life. And third point is the middle way and the negotiation and the dialogue between the central government and the Dalai Lama. I think the middle way, the so-called middle way, has no way. And what he targeted of Dalai Clip is to have Tibetan independence. They have their own slogan, but we need to see also what he did. What he wanted to achieve is the independence of Tibet. If you have, I think, for everybody, if you have the basic knowledge about the situation of Tibet, I think you were not believing what he said. And what the Dalai Lama said is the greater Tibetan zone, in which will never be accepted by the central government of China and also the people of Tibet. And what a Dalai clique wanted to achieve is the high level, the so-called high-level autonomy and the middle way. But I think the motivation, the ultimate motivation, is to maintain the privilege of the feudal serfdom system, which was exercised previously before liberation in Tibet. And I have my personal suggestion is that when you're talking about the issue of Tibet, you needed to figure out what standard point, what perspective you are looking at this issue. We need to focus on and take into consideration the requirement and willingness of the most majority farmers and herdsmen living in Tibet. What they want, what they require, what they want to have and to see. Then we can have a better discussions relating to Tibetan people. Without knowing the basic situation and the basic willingness of the people, then how can we have a sound conclusion about Tibet? And in addition, in the recent years, we have very stable situation in Tibet without any self-immolation cases in Tibet. Maybe there are seldom cases in other provinces which were inhabited by Tibetan people as well.
我们几个都是从小在西藏生活成长起来的嘛。这个我们瀑布市长是山南、拉萨、那曲4个地区工作过。我是西藏有74个县区，每个县我最少去过3趟，绝大多数的乡镇我都去过。那么所有的这个县里面的负责同志，特别是我们的村级啊、群众啊，我们经常性的有深入的 交流沟通意见，他们想要什么，物质上想解决什么，精神上想要什么，我们是最清楚的。所以呢，我觉得还是大多数西藏群众的利益这是最根本的。
Four of us and the Tibetan people, we are born and grown in Tibetan Plateau, and also working there for many years. I myself have been to 74 of the counties and towns in Tibet, and for every counties and towns, at least 3 times. And for Mr. Pupu Dunzhu, he is now the mayor of Shannan City. He has been also previously worked in Lhasa, in Nachu City, and other part of Tibet. I mean, many cities. So during our discussion and dialogues with the local people and the grassroots people, we understand well what they want physically or spiritually, what they want most, and what they need. So we need to take into consideration and fully thinking about what the requirement of the majority of the Tibetan people.
With your permission, we'll ask Madame Lavidière to ask her questions, and we'll allow her to do that, and then we'll wrap up after that. So, Madame Lavidière, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I'd like to highlight
Linguistic rights. Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to highlight the fact that I'm very concerned as well by Tashi Wangchuk's situation and Jendun Choki Nyima, the 11th Panchen Lama. As my colleagues around the table have mentioned, they've asked questions and I won't ask the same ones. I'd like to also state that you've spoken about the importance of understanding the basic situation, the desires of Tibetans, and I agree with that. And I think that is why so many people say that it would be important to allow delegations to travel freely in Tibet and meet with people, the people they want to meet with, because it's the only way to fully understand a situation. When there is freedom of movement, freedom to interact with people when you visit a country. Now, on to my question. I was wondering if you'd met with representatives from the Tibetan community in Canada, and if you have not, would you be willing to do so? Thank you.
刚才我的同事，前面的同事也是问了几个个案的问题，以及刚才所说的丹顿缺基尼玛的问题。那么我也是对此呢表示赞同的。我也想另外说呢，您刚才也是强调了很多这个了解西藏情况，尤其是最基本的一些情况的重要性，以及了解西藏人民需要什么，他们的一些最基本的需求。但是呢，要了解这些，最起码应该让我们能够自由的。来去到西藏，但是呢，我们现在并没有这样的条件，不允许有这样的团组自由的来到西藏了解情况，来见我们想见的人，又谈何来对这些您刚刚所说的情况进行了解呢？所以我想，首先是应该要有一个自由的一个渠道，让我们能够来到西藏。另外一个问题呢是，您是否在这里有这个机会见到在加拿大生活的藏人？ 藏人社区的代表，是否有见过他们？如果没有的，是否打算见？
藏人社区啊，这2天都见了，包括我们在多伦多，今天中午，都已经在这里工作生活的藏胞，我们也进行了交流，沟通，我们也很关心他们，中国对藏胞的政策是一贯的，我们爱国不分家，爱国不分先后，也欢迎他们啊，只要泛起西藏独立的主张，分裂祖国的活动啊，随时都欢迎他们回去，回去定居也可以，也可以回去探亲。我们也希望他们呢，在异国他乡啊，遵守所在国的法律，用自己的双手啊，创造自己更加美好的生活，也会力所能及的提供一些帮助和支持。那么刚才你说西藏，这个想进去了解不太方便的问题，总体呢，西藏和全国一样的，也是开放的。今年是中国改革开放的40周年了。那么中央习近平总书记啊，在海南岛啊，这个宣布了我们国家对外开放的有些重要的政策。西藏呢，对外开放的政策我们不会变，越开会越大。但是呢，西藏又是一个特殊的地区，我们会有一些这个根据地方政府的民族区域自治的有些法律的规定啊，有一些适合西藏特点的有一些规定，但是这个不影响进入西藏。随着改革的深入啊，西藏各方面条件的改善，我相信啊，你们都有机会到西藏去。
You mentioned the Tibetan communities living here in Canada, and actually in Toronto yesterday, and in Ottawa today, I have met the representatives. I mean, the patriotic Tibetan people living here in Canada, and they have a very good life here, and we are really concerned about them, and we will have equal treatment for those patriots, no matter they live inside or outside country. And as long as the Tibetan people, they give up the concept and the act of pursuing Tibet independence, then they are anytime welcomed back to Tibet, no matter living or working. Since now they are working and living in other countries, in Canada, I hope that they can obey the local laws and regulations and to improve their own lives through hard work. And for us, we would like to offer help to them if they have any need. And talking about the free access to Tibet, and this year marks the 40th anniversary of reform and opening up of China, and the central government has a lot of policies issued with President Xi Jinping in Hainan province, also published a lot of further measures for opening up and the reform. I think for Tibet, the policy of opening up will never be changed, and the door will only be more and more open to the outside world. But as I mentioned previously, it is a special area with a particular geological situation, and according to, we would like to conform to the laws and regulations related to the regional ethnic autonomy, and I think it doesn't impact the access to Tibet, and so I do believe that you will have a chance to go to Tibet and have a look at it.
Thank you, Madame Lavadière. To Mr. Bai Ma Wang Dewey, I want to say to you and your colleagues from the Congress of the Autonomous Region of Tibet, thank you very much for your presentation, and thank you for your candidness. I think this has been a very good discussion. As Canadians always do, they ask very direct questions, and we always appreciate the direct answers from our colleagues from other countries abroad. This has been very helpful for us to understand the position of the Autonomous Region of the Congress of Tibet, and we wish you the very best in your trip here in Canada, and continuous success in improving the lives of people that live there. So colleagues, maybe I should get Ms. Chen to interpret that, and then we'll move to other business.
我也是在此呢，借这个机会，代表议会、代表外委会，感谢各位代表代表团与我们进行的交流。您刚才的交流中间展示出呢，也是非常真诚友好的态度。就像加拿大人通常的一个做法，我们都喜欢问非常直截了当的问题。当然呢，也非常希望这个外国朋友能够非常直截了当的回答。就像您刚才所说的，我们进行的交流也是非常有效的。也希望就是您刚才所说的呢，能够对我们加拿大的议员了解西藏非常有帮助。最后呢，也祝愿您此行都访问顺利圆满，也祝愿在这个西藏的政府的领导之下，人民的生活能够取得进一步的改善。就下面进行他们的内部事务了。
谢谢。
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Colleagues, we'll suspend for a couple of minutes, and when our guests leave, then we'll get down to the other orders of business.
然后进行下一个议程。
5:15. So we would like to do some business, and one of the items of business is Madame Lavadière would like the floor. We're not in camera, we're still out of camera for everyone's knowledge, and so Madame Lavadière has a motion she'd like to present and discuss with you, and then we'll put it to a vote, I understand. So can we please have some quiet and everybody take their place? And I'll turn the floor over to Hélène. Madame Lavadière, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief because, yes, we do need to go vote soon. I'd like to table this motion that I will read that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development undertake a study on how Canada can better contribute to peace, security, justice, respect for human rights, and economic development in the Middle East, with particular emphasis on the conflicts in Israel, Palestine, Yemen, and Syria, as well as the spheres of influence of countries in the region, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. That the committee hear from expert witnesses and travel to the region in order to identify areas where Canada can make more positive contributions, and that it report its findings back to the House. End of the motion. Very briefly, I'd like to add that with the news we've heard today about Iran, with the tragedy that we've seen in Yemen, the Israel-Palestine conflict, that's especially difficult at the moment, and the ongoing crisis in Syria, I think it's the least this committee could do that we study this issue, study the ways Canada could better contribute to peace and security in that region of the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Any further discussion? Mr. Janis, please.
I want to thank Ms. Laverdiere for bringing forward this. I just want to kind of qualify a little bit why Conservatives will be voting against this study. I think these are very much important issues, and certainly Ms. Laverdiere has put forward a number of studies which the committee has done recently. One on consular affairs, which we just wrapped up, and there have been other proposals for studies that the committee has adopted. At the same time, there are many different issues to study in terms of foreign affairs. I know that we have a proposal for a study of security threats in Canada's Arctic, and that's something that is right on our immediate doorsteps in terms of our own security. Not to minimize the importance of these issues in the Middle East, certainly that I think all of us are seized with and engaged with in different ways. But at the same time, there has to be a little bit of balance in terms of different members of the committee putting forward different studies that are adopted, and I think we should proceed with the Arctic study, and there may be proposals from other members in terms of what we study as well. But on that basis, just in terms of time allocation and what studies different members have put forward, I think that our side at least is going to vote against this.
Okay. Mr. Reznicki?
I would just like to concur with Mr. Janis's comments, the importance of the subject matter, but also there are a number of subject matters that have been brought forward by other members. We have just concluded this important study on consular affairs, and Ms. Laverdiere has brought forward many very interesting studies, and a number of which we've been seized with. However, there are other motions before the committee, and as a result of that, we'll be voting against.
Last point to Madame Laverdiere.
merci, Monsieur le...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask for a recorded vote, please.
We will have such a recorded vote. Now that there's no further discussion, we'll move to voting for or against the motion. So we'll start with the clerk, and she'll take care of it.
The vote is on the motion moved by Madame Laverdiere. When I call your name, please indicate yea or nay. Mr. Saini? Nay. Mr. Sims? No. Mr. Oliver? No. Mr. Sidhu? No. Mr. Jesnevsky? Mr. McGuire? No. Mr. Genuis? No. Mr. Abul Taif? No. Ms. Laverdiere? Mrs. Laverdiere, excuse me.
Okay.
It's defeated.
The motion is defeated. Thank you, colleagues. Thanks to Madame Laverdiere for bringing forward her motion. Now we'll go into camera and deal with the business that was put to you through the subcommittee report. So,
For a minute to go in camera.
no, I've suspended now. I'm in camera. So,
No, you were public for that.
Oh. Okay, suspend. Now we'll go in camera.